Hello, everyone. I'm Jonna Burke, the Global Managing Director of AMEC, the International Association of Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar of 2021, featuring Annabel Dunstan, the founder and CEO of Question and Retain, and Colin Wheeler, the Managing Director of Survey Solutions. So many times when we're talking about the measurement and evaluation of communications, people forget that having that solid baseline and understanding what your market is thinking, maybe why they're thinking it, and how you can work directly with your customers in that journey to help manage and set those expectations is really critical. And I can't think of two better people than Annabel and Colin to bring this to the forefront for us to really get us all started. So as you're looking at your planning, as you're looking at working with your clients and setting those objectives, I think you're going to have some great takeaways today that you can go back and practically apply at the end of business to be able to say, let's do this smarter, let's do this better, let's do this efficiently. And without further challenge, I will go ahead and turn the time over to Annabel and Colin. Please make sure, one other housekeeping item, please make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A panel, and I'll come back and moderate those for Annabel and Colin at the end of their session. Off to you, Annabel and Colin.
Thanks, Jonna. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm hoping we'll have some fun with this. We've got some points of view that we want to share, and just really some ways of just saying, well, asking a question ourselves, asking a question of you as to why research maybe isn't something that you're using as much as you could. So both Annabel and I are sort of fairly knowledgeable and experienced in running research projects across different kinds. And we also both have a background in communications practice. So I'm assuming that most of the people in the audience are either people who work in the measurement industry or work as PR agencies or practitioners in-house. And you'll be well used to creating campaigns, creating the ideas all the way through into the tangible assets that then go out and making that communication program live. And then the media monitoring agencies, the evaluation insight teams, they'll be taking that, seeing how that plays out in the marketplace. One of my challenges, having worked in the communications sector, is oftentimes I feel that when we start to talk about primary research, it jumps straight through into, well, okay, how's that going to get me a headline? How is that going to be something I can use in a conversation to get something published? And I suppose it's the phrase that to every hammer, everything is a nail. It sort of almost feels that for many people in comms, they just sort of want to jump straight in and say, well, what's the headline? How do I translate that into a story? How do I do that? And I don't suppose there's anything wrong with that. But for me, I see quite a big gulf and a gap in terms of the way of using research and getting the most value out of it. So Annabel, I've just started having done a little bit of a kickoff. What would your comments on that be? Is thinking about clients you work with, is that something you see on occasion?
Yeah, Q&R, we occupy a very niche part of research. Like, as you mentioned quite rightly, I come from a comms background. And when I left the world of PR, I was really interested in how do you bring rigor into understanding what clients are thinking and feeling and measuring that, and also what employees are thinking and feeling. So that whole piece, happy team, happy client, creating that virtuous circle. So I wanted to put data into the center of that. And I think some of the stuff that we come up against is kind of rooted in fear, actually, when I pull it all together. So if you look at an agency, a leadership team, if they don't want to understand what the team or the clients are really thinking and feeling and doing some deep dive work on that, then I think that comes from a place of fear in case of what it might open up. You've also got internal gatekeepers. Again, that's based in fear. Perhaps we've done a very good job at PRing themselves within the agency and haven't escalated issues upwards, and actually when you lift the bonnet up, there's some stuff going on. And then actually the work really starts once you've done the research. It's acting on the data, and based on business rhythms, and of course with COVID time, there's been a lot of all hands to the pump. It's then how do you then act on that data? And so that can be a resource issue as well. So there's some of the themes and objections we are looking to overcome when we work with a new client. But flipping that, obviously it's a huge missed opportunity if you don't ask those questions. It's all about listening better, particularly in these times, on the internal side, employees, to measure mental health and well-being, for example. But the bigger picture with client sat is that you can really help grow your business through proper research. You identify your brand ambassadors, those who are really happy with you right now. And at the other end of the scale, the latent grumblers, as we call them, those that might have something going on, but they're not really voicing it in the catch-ups with their day-to-day contact, but it can come through effective research. So that's the area of specialism that I can wax lyrical about. And Colin, you've got a broad experience around research, but getting people to understand that it's a dialogue. You're trying to understand what employees or clients are feeling and thinking by using research in an effective way is where I focus. There's also other benefits of doing that, is that you can improve your product offer by really testing what's landing well and what's not, and measuring that sentiment over time. Seeding the idea that you've got new service propositions, particularly as people have pivoted business and perhaps offering more digital services. So it's a real opportunity to test that with your audiences. And to identify what's working well and to match that up. So if the team feel they've got a weakness or don't feel they're getting the training and development, is that what your clients are picking up on? So matching that data up is also a great opportunity for people to think about.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely right, and I do absolutely get that that fear, or at least anxiety about, as you say, lifting up the hood and seeing what's there, because one of the advantages of not doing it is that if you don't have the problem laid out and put in front of you, you don't have to do anything about it. And when we have busy schedules and big to-do lists and somebody probably quite senior shouting at you to get the next thing done, it sort of seems, well, why would you create more work for yourself by asking questions you don't want to know the answer to? And I also think there's that sort of challenge is, if I know that I'm not making my customer happy, I'm going to have to sort them out. Well, right now, as you mentioned, obviously with everything that's going on, time of lots of uncertainty and anxiety for people, especially amongst employees, but I think it's more widespread than that. But I think sometimes you miss, or people can miss the fact that that's an opportunity, and to take advantage of that opportunity, you have to gain an understanding of the landscape, the marketplace. A favorite kind of sort of mantra is, which I think is getting less and less credible now, but it's the idea within communications especially, it's more art than science, it's about gut feel. And when you're talking about fear, it's quite interesting because I put that into the context of risk. And if you're talking about risk management, you manage that risk more effectively by getting better intelligence, better data, and better understanding. And that actually enables you to take more risk, because you're taking it from a place where you've got more certainty about the level of risk you're incurring, as opposed to, well, I think that particular idea will work. I think that particular new product will be a brilliant thing. I'm sure there is demand for this in the marketplace. And you end up investing an awful lot of money, effort, time into an idea or something that actually is not quite as relevant as you thought it was, or is not quite relevant for the current times or the circumstances that are being experienced by folks. I mean, even something as simple as customer satisfaction is, there's so many different ways that you can link into it, because it's a fount of ideas. It should be a go-to resource for people who are trying to innovate, whether it be around products and services, or whether it's just about how do you communicate to me? What's relevant to me? What's interesting to me? And you can get that through all sorts of feedback, but customer satisfaction is a cracking one, because you're actually saying, how have you experienced my product and service? What is it that you've experienced that you would like to tell other people about? What was it? Why would you recommend us? Those sort of questions are really valuable in getting an extra layer, and it's using that sort of data effectively and bringing it into your practice is really important. And I think it's a big part to big onus that should be on people in practice, whether you be in-house, whether you be a PR agency, or whether you're an evaluation business. You should be asking to have access to some of this information to help you do your overall job better.
Yeah, if I can build on that, a great quote that I often use is arrive with data, leave with respect. So if you picture the boardroom, and we know that the finance director will often turn up with, their management accounts, and there'll be measurement in place for campaigns. But often for the communications director or head of internal comms or the HR function, that seems to be a poorer cousin in terms of using data to their advantage. So that arrive with data, leave with respect, it takes away the gut feeling, it supports the gut feel, it fills in those information gaps. So absolutely, and the word I want to pick up on that you used was understanding. And I think that is the way it's going. It's much more, it's less about whether your customer or client is satisfied, it's do you really understand them, and back to that sense that it's creating a dialogue between you. And I think this year has shown, if nothing else, that we do really need to get under the skin of what our clients and customers and staff are feeling. And through really well-formed questions that give a sense that you are keen to understand. It's not just about commercial gain and, what can we sell you more of? It's what are your pain points? What can we do to help you? What are your where are you struggling, and what can we do as an agency or client to support you? Absolutely.
Absolutely. And it just made me spiral off into thinking about just the way people sometimes use the data, and whether it be designing of a questionnaire, and you think, okay, so I want to see this, and the leading questions and the classic, have you stopped beating your wife, which is the one that always kind of like makes me sort of, okay, that's clearly the worst case of a leading question. And then you see all of the spectrum into the much more subtle ones. But I think it's an interesting time because people are willing to give information. People are willing to share data if they think, actually, this will help me get a better experience. But also I suppose it's a term that's been overused and a bit dated now almost, because it's been so widely commented on, but this idea of a citizen data scientist. Well, you don't have to be that big of sophisticated an expert in analysing data. But over the last year, if there is one thing that people have been speaking about, it's our numbers, which people poorly understand. It's the lag in data versus the number of infections. This sort of thing is suddenly seeing science being presented front and foremost. And I was really frustrated as somebody who presents data regularly about the way that in advance of the second lockdown, things were being presented, this data from the various tracking, the very excellent work the Office of National Statistics do, but it was the way the data was being presented in such a way, so it's sort of like, okay, we're going to gently push you along this little path, and you're not supposed to realize that you could have taken, no, we're not stupid. People aren't stupid. And when you treat us like we're stupid by asking leading questions or by not asking the questions that are really important. I mean, why would you not ask me about something that's a real critical part of the service or the product? Of course you must do that. You don't ask things because you don't want to know. It's really obvious to us, and it feels therefore that you are not being transparent, not being honest, not being interested, and sort of brings into question about the credibility of what you're doing. And I think that's really critical. And while we can talk about primary research data as a classic example where that can be really exposing, I think it's more broadly, if you've got a situation where you don't want to find something out, you can really end up very exposed if you don't be open and honest and give, when you're asking for opinion, let people give a full opinion.
I think that's absolutely right. And the other thing to say, a couple of things you've said, is if people give their time, of course, we've got to be very wary of survey fatigue. Fatigue with Zoom, we have fatigue with surveys. So it's making sure that what you ask is really relevant to the audience and that it's topical, so that it's going to ignite their interest in it, and then it's timely, it's sent out at a time that works for them, but also holds that relevance. I mean, there's so many aspects to this. I think, yeah, particularly survey fatigue.
I mean, I think there's that for me, and I often use this when I'm just talking about it. It's like you want a survey to be as long as it needs to be and no longer. And I think I'm paraphrasing somebody like Mark Twain or something like that. But it is that thing. But the way that you can have a longer survey and ask more questions and get more detail is you make people interested in participating in the survey because you're asking them relevant questions. And one of the huge advantages of something like an online survey is you can tailor your questions based on the responses that somebody's given. So you're not going to ask me half a dozen questions which are completely not interesting to me, not related to anything I've experienced. You're going to actually be able to tailor those questions so they only appear if I've said that I'm interested or find them relevant. And that again means that I'm more willing to commit my time. But there's an interesting bit about creating. Thank you, Kirsten. So there's anything about you're creating a sense that because you've made sure this is a well-designed, relevant survey, you are going to do something with it.
Absolutely, and I think that's really critical, is the idea that you build trust. And when you embark on a particular benchmarking exercise that you're going to perhaps do quarterly or 6 monthly, is you demonstrate very quickly that you have heard, you've listened, and that where possible you're acting on that data. Collecting the data is just, a small part of the job. So you've got to create that trust loop of then actually doing something with it and feeding back. So you said, we heard, we have, which I think is absolutely key. The other point is the quant data. So yes, let's get the data points in, the quant, but the qualitative is where the gold dust sits, and it's the drivers behind why they chose option 1 through 5 or yes through no, not at all. And there's so many sophisticated ways now of pulling that through spider web technology to bring that in to do the sentiment analysis. And that's where the real hard work starts for our clients, is actually to then form the action plans with our help to then act on that data. But yeah, don't miss an opportunity to collect the qual when you're busy gathering your quant.
I mean, thinking about the questions that we've said we're going to cover, and I just want to make sure I'm always doing that. It's about halfway point or the way through. It's just making sure. I suppose I've got a strong background working in marketing and branding, especially around advertising tracking, but also comms development. And you can sometimes see it get quite narrow in terms of when you're using survey research for comms development piece. And it's thinking, well, okay, what else can we learn? And in every time you're doing a piece of research, because let's face it, even if you're incredibly highly profitable international PLC, budgets are not infinite. You are going to have to come across those situations where you need to reconcile and restrain your ambition. But you can actually do some really clever things by thinking, well, there's a piece of tracking survey, there's a piece of tracking research that's going on over there. How do you integrate that? How do you integrate that piece of custom SAP research? How do you include that piece of research with the telephone center performance? And bringing those threads together. And sometimes you don't necessarily need to complete a whole independent piece of research. It's actually pulling those bits of analysis from the surveys and the data that you've already got. And when you think about then the comms development piece, I'm surprised at how infrequently people who work in comms say, well, have you got any research into your customer audience that your marketing team have done? Knowing that the marketing team might have just been spending several hundreds or millions of pounds on a marketing campaign, a big glossy print outdoor TV advertising campaign. Do you know what? Their marketing team will have done a lot of research on that campaign. They would have done a lot of research to find out how that messaging lands, how they expect the audience to react in terms of behavior change. And they'll be tracking it in some way. Well, comms can do the same thing, because those messages to that target audience, it's not that different from the messages that you want to get out in your comms. And those sorts of things about just thinking more broadly and thinking how to link everything together is really, really critical for me.
Yeah, it's basically upcycling. It's recycling gone before and repackaging, repurposing. In fact, when we work with anybody new, we always say, what data are you sitting on? What data story can we tell with that already sits within the organization? And it's incredibly liberating, and it helps join up those silos, because quite rightly, yes, who knows who's done what, but if you do an analysis to understand who's sitting on what, you can bring a lot of threads together without a penny being spent. So really recommend that as a takeout from this, to ask across your different departments what they're sat on, because you could repurpose that for sure.
Not to do myself out of fees, I probably would charge a day or so of consultancy fees to bring that together, but but you're right, exactly right. But yeah, it is about bringing those threads together and finding value. And the other aspect of doing that is sometimes you go and speak to somebody in, I don't know, the customer insights team within a client organization, or you go and speak to the marketing team, and you say, well, I'm working with the comms team and we'd like to do this piece of analysis. Is there anything you would like us to explore while we're doing that analysis? And you'll probably find that there's something that's been on the back burner that nobody's quite got time to do, but it's the right data set to look at. And you can actually help them. And all of a sudden you've got this real virtual of a win-win for both the team that you're asking for information and for their time in dragging it together and putting it together for you, as well as the team that actually potentially is your immediate client.
Yeah, I think that's a smart move, to involve people external from the team that are looking at the piece of research, because they can bring a fresh look at it, whether that's an external consultant organisation or someone outside the team within their own business. And it just gives that fresh pair of eyes. And also just to tickle that, well, what's your gut feeling? You know, where's the information gap? Where do we need a data point that can back that up to drive strategy? So, I mean, I have a lot of, I thought when I started doing research, it seemed quite a dry area, but actually I've really got into the human interest side of it. What makes people tick? What dialogue can I start having through asking good questions? Which has been really stimulating. So I don't really see it as research at all. I see it as relationship building. And it's another arm of new business, in a way, of understanding what people think and feel and need and want. And research is just a catch-all for then putting some data points into that to then be able to track it over time. We've worked with Hotwire, who are obviously very key with AMEC and measurement over, I think, 6 or 7 years now, measuring their client sat. And I think we've totted up over 300 new biz leads have come as a result of understanding what their clients think and feel, and understanding who their brand ambassadors are. So it's real golden nuggets for them, doing that on a yearly basis.
I think that's fabulous. It's just recognizing that idea is there. And actually something you were talking about picking up some of these threads. One of the criticisms that used to be very prevalent in people who worked in primary research was that they stuck to the facts, as the famous quote from the detective shows in the US came. Just the facts. It's just like there wasn't a lot of confidence in creating a bit of a story or creating a narrative that held all of these things together. And in part that was a lack of confidence that was genuine within the industry at the time, which is going back a while. But it's interesting to think about those people who work in comms practice. They are actually very, very good at stringing together a narrative. Sometimes they don't want the inconvenient facts, which gets back to what we said at the earlier point in the discussion, where some of those things don't fit. But actually creating that story and creating that narrative becomes much more powerful. And that's how it works. That creating that narrative and understanding comes from little bits of this bit and that, put it together, making sure it's consistent, making sure it's not contradicting what you already know, but then all of a sudden you have a much more powerful platform to build. Maybe it's a comms platform for. Conscious of the people who are working in the evaluation industry side of it, and obviously working, looking at understanding how all of the big campaigns that their clients are involved in are performing. But that's also something which I think is part and parcel of creating that narrative, finding that story that brings it all together. Because I think in evaluation sector, I think you can often find that people are, I just want to work with my data. So I know how much coverage there's been. I've got some figures for the reach. I've got this, I've got that. I've got this sentiment criteria. And it's like, well, okay, so I'm going to stick with that story, but not reaching outside to say, well, okay, so what else can we put as input to this? If you think about the Barcelona principles and the integrative evaluation framework, you're trying to get to, from the inputs, from the strategy, you have your outcomes, your outputs, and your outtakes. Sorry, outputs, outtakes, outcomes. And you want to generate that outcome. And one of the huge positives that you can get from primary research is the outcome, which is a change in behavior or a change in perception. And that's something that comes very easily, very readily measured by market research, primary research. So it's thinking about, well, okay, so you've got that. That's something that you should be integrating with your measurement reporting, with your evaluation, because that gives you that tool. And, excuse me, that extra sort of extra data point that makes it more credible, that brings together, okay, well, it's now consistent with not just the work that we're getting, the reporting we're getting from our evaluation agency, we're also seeing that that's consistent with what our marketing agencies are telling us, or what our comms people are telling us. And because it's come from multiple sources, it's got multiple credibility in a wider base within an organization. And I think comms, the comms team and the evaluation agencies, they often have actually more opportunity to go in and ask that, because they can say, well, you don't just make the introduction, let me have the introduction, and then I'll see what I can work with those teams.
Yeah, I think not being afraid to evolve what you're asking as well. Yes, have your benchmarks, but coming back to that, make sure that it's timely, topical and relevant. And so building space to have 2 or 3 questions which move with the times, because that creates your interesting thought leadership stuff, and gets the client to clock that you are thinking 1 step ahead of them. So don't sit and rest on your laurels with that you've come up with for the measurement framework for the year. Keep evolving that, because times are changing. So you need to be showing and demonstrating that you are on the ball with that. I'm going to rush to my fridge, which has got an alarm going off. Give me 2 seconds.
No, I think that's very opposite. You've got very few plans that were set in place at the start of 2020 are, well, if they lasted till April, I would have been surprised. But if they lasted to September, then something was going wrong, because it's completely changed the landscape. One of the things that I guess both you and I will look at, and we'll talk to clients about, is benchmarking, and how similar organisations might have seen similar responses to different questions. And I'm sort of thinking that for the next 3 years, probably, that benchmarking is going to be fairly dated. It's going to be like what happened after the tech boom, tech bust in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the financial crash in the 2008, 2009. Is that all of those sort of certainties have become a lot less certain now, and it's sort of waiting to see how they land moving forward. So that requires a bit more imagination and a bit more seeking out additional points of reference, so that you can be sure that you're on the right track and that you've got certainty, building certainty. Just thinking what else I want to cover. So the working with different audiences, and I suppose there's also just thinking about other types of way of challenging your clients in a positive sense. So it's to what you're talking about in terms of evolving and adapting, but keeping on top of the results. So it's not just the survey the marketing team might have done this week, or that you might have for a particular campaign that you're looking for, but it's also thinking about, well, what's the next one? What's the next thing we want to explore? And can we, for example, ask the customer satisfaction tracking agency, can we ask them to add a couple of questions on, and not being afraid to do it? Because you know what, there's something happening within the customer marketplace that needs to be kept an eye on, and the input from the comms team is just as valid and as helpful as is from the marketing team.
Yeah, I think mixing it up as well. So we know that face-to-face and focus groups are obviously key, and you can get some really valuable content from that. Telephone surveys as well. But I think not being afraid is a good thing to remember, and to challenge your client to think beyond that they've probably stuck with for a while. I'm just noticing some questions coming through and conscious of time. So do we need to?
Yeah, so what I was going to sort of kind of think about was just throwing a few last minute comments regarding we know that if you've got campaigns that have got a broad number of channels that are involved, they can be more effective because the channels build. There's good data out there to show that. You've got media and advertising agencies. The advertising agencies, especially the media buying agencies, there's a whole load of media data. It's just always be looking for more data. Challenge yourself to think, well, what data might there be? I used to tell a story where I was sat next to somebody at an awards dinner, and I chatted to them, and I was talking about a story back when I worked as a client-side researcher, and they went away, and I saw them at the same awards dinner. We were both judges about a year later, and he suggested that he'd saved sort of hundreds of thousands of pounds, because I'd said, you've got lots of research out there which doesn't date. People's attitudes and perceptions, notwithstanding an event like COVID, but they don't tend to change that quickly. They still tend to have the same priorities, especially around products and services. It's about reliability, it's about responsiveness, it's about suitability, it's about relevance. All of those things won't shift in an instant. So don't rush off to get new research just because the last piece of research was done more than a month ago. Maybe just look to try and find those ways to reuse and to use your word, upcycle some of that research.
Something worth thinking about is if you're working with large corporates is to look at the use of research to understand how different departments are working with each other. So whilst you save money by getting them not to do research, we worked with a client on quite a small project in the end, but it helped them to work out between sales and marketing that the materials that marketing were busy spewing out weren't actually landing with sales at the coalface, and they were using different stuff. And it transpired that the marketing department then saved £250,000 of that they were due to then produce and put into print. That was for a bank. And so, you know, for very small investment on the research side, massive saving. So yes, there are two sides of that coin. Something I'd like to mention is I'm an anthropologist by training, and I had a fantastic time at uni, but one of the main things I took away from it and have used through my business life ever since is the idea of stepping into another's shoes. It's all about understanding it from the other's perspective. And I think that's really important when you put out any research, any piece of research, is to imagine you're the user, the other end, the respondent, the recipient. What's your experience of that going to be? So A, does the tool work for you? Does it look good? Does it feel good? And we're in a very fast moving society now where we expect things to be really slick and be able to answer quickly and for it to be really clean and clear. So that's an absolute no-brainer. But again, I'm going to bang on about it. Are the questions relevant to me as the recipient? Do they pique my interest? Do I want to give my few minutes of time? And use questions that have an emotional, that capture the emotion. So how would you chat to someone down at the pub or at the bar? It wouldn't be, well, how do you rate this on 1 to 10? It would be, well, you know, how are you feeling? So that's very much an emotional approach that we would use that I think generates a higher response rate and more levels of engagement with our audiences. So that was just a few things to think about. So anthropology, step into others' shoes and really imagine their experience before you send anything out.
I can only think about the fun that you must have had studying your fellow students as an anthropologist. The microcosm in itself. So I think I'd sum up the sort of things that I've been thinking about for this session is just suggesting to people that there's a lot more opportunity out there to integrate primary research within the work you do. You don't necessarily have to commission it yourself. You can tap into that's been undertaken by your clients for other purposes. Or if you're doing a piece of primary research for a comms purpose, to find those supporting nuggets for a campaign idea or something similar, don't just use it for that. Find the other parts of the organization that would always also benefit from getting a better understanding of the customer. And while we've talked a couple of times in reference to for large clients, for a small business, that's a good way to get funding for a primary research project, is that you actually integrate lots of different requirements in terms of that customer understanding that you can integrate with a piece of analysis and research. I think for media monitoring and insights agencies, for me, I just think, please start asking for this and start pushing your clients for this. And if your clients don't have time to do it, maybe explore it and get an introduction to parts of the organization of your client that might have it, just because it rounds out what you do, it makes what you do more valuable, and that can't be a bad thing in a time when certainly for some clients there will be pressures that will mean that they have to be more effective and more efficient with the budgets that they have. Survey research is a really powerful tool, and I think it can help everybody understand their customers better and execute better campaigns. It's important to be understanding of using and the way to use research credibly, and just recognize that you've got quite savvy audiences out there and they're only getting more savvy. Think about what the opportunity is, especially during current times of unrest. There's that ability to target your audience better if you understand them better and understand what their priorities are, which is entirely Annabel's point about relevance there. And I think I'd also just say it's collaborating with the other people in your organization who are responsible for communicating to customers, if you're in the customer service team, or talk to your comms team, talk to your marketing team. Those three components of many businesses are so integral to the whole customer experience, and getting them all to work together is going to make you a more powerful and successful business, and your agency should be supporting you in it, or you as an agency should be looking to support your clients doing that. So I think we're a little bit light on time, but that gives us plenty of questions, and there have been a few coming in, so I might get Jonna to come back on.
Fantastic, you guys. Thank you so much. I know that I'm receiving a lot of messages and people saying, I wish I could just eavesdrop on their conversation for about 3 days to give me enough of those takeaways and nuggets to be able to really implore that with our team. So thank you so much. And we do have several questions, so let's go ahead and get started. The first question that we have is, can you help with one of the toughest questions is, how do I overcome the no time and no budget of my organization? Colin, let's go ahead and get started with you for that one.
Sure. So this is not a new challenge. It's been there for every single agency and every single interaction, I suspect, because there will always be things that as an agency you'll want to do, as a client they'll want to do, but they don't have the capacity. It is about risk. It's about managing risk. It's about, if you can use your invested time and money more effectively, then you will be more effective. You'll be more successful in your professional capacity, but your business will be more successful. It's really a question of, is it worth your not investing the time in getting good data? Now, clearly, if you're investing in a campaign of a few £1,000s, it's not going to be appropriate to invest a few £1,000s, similar sort of budget, in primary research. But if you're investing a couple of £100,000 in a piece of activity, well, then surely it makes sense to be doing some testing to make sure that it's going to land in the way that you want it. And there's not a marketing campaign of any significant size that doesn't have an awful lot of research that goes on before it lands. And if there's one thing we can learn from some of our colleagues in the marketing practice, that is definitely there, because there's some not great communications campaigns that sometimes get pushed out. You think somebody could have just tapped you on the shoulder and said, you might want to think twice about that. Well, that's what research will do. It will do. It will make sure that you get your messaging right. It will make sure it will land the way you want it to. And yeah, it is about using time and money, but it's a worthwhile investment of time and money.
Great, thanks. Annabel, anything to add for the tips and tricks to helping people find the time and budget to conduct effective research?
Yeah, I mean, nothing focuses minds more than return on investment. And so can you link what you're planning to do to a commercial outcome? And so we've grown Question Retain on the basis that there was no budget line for what we wanted to sell to people. We've had to educate around what the benefits are when you do land this stuff, when you do understand how happy or otherwise your clients are, because it generates those new business leads, or at least statements around how happy they are. So yeah, focus minds on ROI. What's the positive of this if we do this piece of research? And absolutely, to Colin's point, it needs to be in ratio to that they're due to spend in connection with that campaign. No time, I think no time is bollocks, basically.
We have it, our first bollocks use in a webinar this year. Thank you. For those of you playing bollocks bingo with us, that is done. So
if you think about before COVID, I don't know if anyone else felt like this, but we were kind of whizzing around on a merry-go-round, everyone too busy for everything. And suddenly when the world stopped and we had to just take stock, suddenly time opened up. Our calendars were empty for a month or two. And I think it's repositioned time management and how we handle time. So now is the time to get stuff done that's going to support your strategy and your campaign. So yeah, I have fierce objections to people saying they have no time. It's how we organize ourselves.
So that leads us nicely into the next big challenge that people are having, and that is, what are your recommendations in working with hesitant leadership who aren't of the belief of asking the questions to get those answers, or feel like they know what the market wants without some of that reassurance? Annabel, let's go ahead and get started with you on that one.
Well, that's when you need your business therapy hat on. It's getting them on the couch and understanding what lies beneath that. What is the fear? What have they had happen in the past when they've opened up the bonnet or the hood? What's happened for them? So once you start to get them to open up about that story, you can then see where their fear is setting in and the paralysis. So it's listening. It's listening, letting them tell their story, letting them get it all out about why this is a bad idea for them. And then you can start to overcome each of those objections. So it's really getting to the root of what that block's about. And I meet it probably in 50% of new prospects I talk to. It's, a bit afraid of doing that. And it's about us as a supplier, obviously building that trust, but you have to build trust within the team that whatever gets exposed or found out, it's not about pointing fingers or apportioning blame. It's about people seeing that there's a problem. Here's the problem on the table, and let's get together as a team and work out how we solve that. So there's a skill in getting people to that point, obviously. And basically, when I'm not doing research, I'm a therapist. But yeah, it's all about understanding fear and building trust, and then showing the benefits and keeping that loop complete.
And Colin, not to steal your thunder, because I'm sure you're going to talk about how the integrated evaluation framework also helps you with some of those internal battles, but how is it that, that you work with some leaders who are a little bit hesitant?
I mean, for me, it's about fear again, but I tend to, depending on the situation, and I do very much that, I'm probably going to use that business therapist line. Fear of, is your competitor asking these questions? Because if your competitor's asking these questions and they're getting a good and better understanding of your target customer through asking those questions, how do you feel about that? And are you completely comfortable? Because if you're completely comfortable, then I'm not sure you should be. But yes, it's like anything. There are good challenges to be made. Research is not the be all and end all. Market research will not solve every single problem. There are absolutely stuff which gets asked to consumers. I mean, I actually genuinely have experienced a situation where a company went out to customers and said, could you tell us what our business strategy should be? I mean, that's a fundamental failure of leadership right there. If you don't have any idea what your strategy should be, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. And asking your customers is not the right thing to do. Set your strategy out. Yes, you have to own that. But certainly, yeah, it's about saying, well, are you that complacent? And I don't think this is a world, and hasn't been, forget COVID, this is far too competitive a marketplace now to allow complacency to be driving your marketing strategy and your customer insight strategy. To your point about things such as the Barcelona Principles, which obviously sets out that guidance, and the integrated evaluation framework, yeah, this is an input. This is a critical input, because if you're struggling to try and identify what impact does comms have versus all the other stuff that's happening in the landscape of your target customer, well, then research is a good tool for doing that, because it will help you unpick it. It may not be the data scientist two standard deviations kind of certainty, but it will definitely give you insight, and it will definitely give you confidence that you're doing the right thing, or what to change about what it is that you're doing.
Fantastic. Let's go to the next question. Thanks to both of you. First of all, thanks for the great conversation. I'm in the World Bank in the Dominican Republic. You keep mentioning the brand ambassadors. What is the difference between them and stakeholders? And can you give us some examples of engagement with them after we consult with them? I think that's probably one of those big challenges, right? With any survey, if you don't do something with the results, if you don't have that follow-up, that's the big challenge that people see. So integrating that in with the survey and what that plan will be after.
So brand ambassadors, it's a term we've used, and it's really to identify those of your clients or customers who absolutely love what you do. They're in a very happy place. They're waxing lyrical about what a brilliant service or product you provide them. So stakeholders generally sit external to your business, and they might be influencers or opinion formers, but your brand ambassadors, when we conduct a client or customer satisfaction, are literally the people who are loving what you do right now. And how to maximize that? Well, with the qualitative data we collect, it's about capturing their words. What have they said right now about you that is in very glowing terms? So these are the happiest people when we've conducted a piece of research, a pulse check as it's called. And how to use that, I mean, that's another whole webinar, but it's around making it really easy for your happy client or customer, stroke brand ambassador, to then recommend you into their network, either internally within their organizations, that you start working for other parts of it, or to their ecosystem, their LinkedIn contacts. Your best new business contacts are through your weak links. So who are your clients connected to? And if you've got them in a really happy place, wrap up a nice case study that talks to one of their a weak link of yours, but one of their contacts, and really maximize that and do that within a week or so of getting their positive comment in. That's a starter for 10. Yeah. Does that help?
Absolutely. Anything to add, Colin?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely right. For that sort of very specific brand ambassador audience, I think that's a really effective thing to do. I sometimes think also there's just making sure you go back to your customers who've participated in the research, or even who haven't, and just say, this is what we found. I think it's especially true with business to business relationships where you've got, I'm just trying to think of an appropriate way to anonymize a client, but you've got a product that's being delivered, and probably 80% of the account management conversations are very transactional, if not 90 to 95%. Having an opportunity to go and sit with a client and say, I'd like to take you through some things that we had in terms of our customer feedback, and sitting down and chatting through. So I don't know if you were able to respond to the survey, but do you recognize this feedback? That's a fascinating, positive conversation to be having, because it's away from the transactional, it's moving into more of the relationship kind of discussion. And I think you can extend that to more broadly. If you're sharing feedback that you received about your business, about your feedback you've been given from your survey, I think that's a great way to engage your target audience at all levels. And it's just, you can take it to the extreme in that sort of senior client relationship, or you can just say, hi guys, we've heard this feedback, thank you. If there's any other feedback you'd like to give us, we'd welcome to hear it. And it shows that you're listening, and it shows you care about your customers.
Fantastic, fantastic. Let's get to the next question. Can you speak about the challenge of identifying and reaching the right target audience to survey? Maybe the Holy Grail, the other Holy Grail. And then results from the surveys are only relevant to the extent opinions come from the target audience, which sometimes are not easy to reach. There's a tendency to survey the easy to reach audiences, but not always the relevant ones. How do you bridge that chasm?
I think we'll both have some good thoughts on this. Yes, you're right. It's not easy. I suppose, and I've answered a similar question in a previous discussion, probably I think at the AMEC conference, which is, if you can't interview the hard to reach audience, don't ignore the easy to reach audience, because there will be some value there. But in some way, shape or form, you must be able to reach that audience. So a big online survey is probably not appropriate to an audience in maybe a low-income country where you're talking about people who are perhaps affected by poverty. I did see who the question came from. But you probably have workers in those countries, or perhaps sister agencies that you can speak to who work in those countries, whom you can interview. And maybe you can interview them as experts, or you can get them to facilitate maybe conversations with some of the people that you're trying to reach and trying to help. So there are ways to do it. You have to be subtle, and you have to understand sometimes that there are audience you can't reach. And particularly when you're trying to address certain social issues, there are audiences that are going to be very, very difficult to reach, and survey is an appropriate tool. But you do need to be able to try and find understanding. And so maybe it's like identifying the sort of people who have casework worker or stakeholder roles with those audiences to get their feedback on how they can best be helped.
Annabel?
Yeah, I mean, I get the EBGBs if I've got a client that wants to go out to a cold audience, and I as far as possible, try and advise against it. And it's about using your own CRM if you're trying to form opinion around stuff. So I think making sure that your own data is in really good shape so that you have a warmed up audience to seek opinions. And of course, you need to then ensure you've got diversity and global reach, which can be tough for some smaller organizations. Buying in data, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's cold, and it's even the best data houses fall short, I would say. So make sure you've got brilliant CRM, make sure you are expanding the net of your reach and that of your clients. So mine for perceptions and thoughts and feedback from a warmed up audience, because you're going to get a better response rate, and you'll get the outliers within that. You'll have the bell curve with the outliers anyway. But I think it's probably more Colin's bag for the very hard to reach audiences. So I'll pass that buck.
Well, in fairness, I've had a few instances of having to do with it. The other thing that's can be quite an interesting approach is to try a community approach, where you identify a small group of people who can form a part of a community, which might not be somebody you get together very frequently, but it might be a group that you tap into occasionally, or you sort of arrange some sort of gathering. Obviously it would be online now, but I suspect it would probably be online would be a good way of doing it, just so you can share some ideas, get some opinions, get some feedback, and find ways to move your objectives forward.
I think being innovative around it too, so using Vox Pops, getting people to submit video clips, send photographs via Instagram, and then seeding some questions into that. So innovation, it's not all about email surveys. You know, if it is a hard to reach audience, where do they fish? What makes them tick? So again, this anthropology idea is put yourself in their shoes. What are they going to respond to, and get to them in that way?
So a follow-up to the very first question, and that is, do you have any suggestions or recommendations on how to do cheap, we won't use that word, but cost-effective research surveys, and what are some of those tips that you provide?
My tips are less is more. Don't be too greedy for data. Only bite off that you can chew. So that suddenly puts a size limit around your research. Ask more regularly, but less is more. And shop around. There's a lot of brilliant research companies out there that if you want to use an external resource, but you might well have the capacity within. There's lots of tools that you can get off the shelf, and then you can just go external for the consultancy, so that you can run it all yourselves, but seek advice externally to really ensure that you're asking smart questions. So that's a couple of cost savers. Yeah,
and I'd have to say, I have to agree. I mean, data collection per se is not that expensive, by which I mean we can't charge that much for it, and those people who are working media monitoring will understand that challenge, where the amounts the clients were willing to pay for effective media coverage capture has reduced over time. You want to make sure you're spending your money on the expert advice and the analysis piece that you need. The one slight caveat is think about whether or not you need advice on writing the questions, because writing the questions is not as obvious as it seems to be. And I often use the example of, I look to design my reporting outputs to help me understand what questions I want to ask, so I don't ask the wrong question. Because I can ask a question about a topic 2 or 3 different ways. But if I've asked the question the wrong way, I won't get the answer I want. I won't get the answer that allows me to do something differently within my business.
And that's so critical, I think, in being able to have that expertise, because, the old adage of tell me what you want the answer to be and I'll tell you which question to ask, right? But if you're really looking for insights and to understand and to interpret the shift or a change in your audience, you really have to be open with how you're doing that in order to let that information and those insights come through. And I think, you guys have touched on so many of those other elements, is how to be keen to then embrace that once you do start to see some smoke, or gosh, this is different, or we're starting to see this trend now in some of these responses. What does this really mean? And what are those elements that it's affecting? All right, I'm going to be very cheeky and sneak in one last question. And then, hopefully we can have you guys maybe come back later in the year and or do a couple of blog posts for us, where I know that some of these things and some of these resources she asked. So, looking at these, it's really so critical. And this really is such an important piece. But the last question we're going to get to is, AMEC has introduced societal dimensions to the Barcelona principles this year. Can you say how this is going with organizations, and are societal agendas becoming a growing aspect of communications research?
So I'm guessing, because I'm just trying to think exactly what the question is referring to. This is more sort of about CSR and broader societal impact.
Right, ESG, and looking at those elements of the business. When we did the update to the Barcelona principles, we did start to talk about, what are the societal impacts, so that you are looking, to a larger data set, and looking more at those, that field data, those emotions of what's driving some of those changes.
So, I mean, my observation would be that the last year has accentuated issues related to the poverty gap, wealth inequality, things like job security, and then broader speaking, things like climate change. So forget COVID, we could maybe solve COVID, but there's actually some really significant risks that are going to happen if certain actions aren't taken in the next 20 years. So we could focus on the next 12 months getting everybody vaccinated, but because we've screwed up everything else, and in 20 years time, we'll still be facing a problem. So I don't think businesses can get away from it. And I think consumers are and will continue to take on that as a bigger issue. And that means it's relevant to your audiences. And if it's relevant for consumers, if you're more in a business environment, then it will be relevant for your clients too, because you will be affected by the way that consumers will interact with those other businesses. So yeah, it's critical. There are more and more ways it's going to need to be measured, and yeah, people are going to have to show that they're doing stuff which is valid and meaningful. And that's a Barcelona principles and integrated evaluation framework. What does it actually mean and translate into tangible action? Because if it's not seen to be that, then we're back to what we were talking about in terms of using data in a false way. You're damaging your own credibility. Sorry, Annabel, I'll give you a chance to respond.
That's all right. I can look at the internal picture quickly. So employee engagement. In fact, just before this call, I was talking to the president of the Institute of Internal Communications, and their emphasis for the coming year is going to be around cultural change, leadership communications, and health and well-being, all of which sit in that space. So it's really understanding, our culture's evolving to be kinder as a result of COVID. How does line management work when you're working from home? Health and well-being, the mental health impact, the third wave after the second wave of COVID, the third wave will be the mental health impact. So yes, I think in communications research on the internal side for internal comms and staff well-being within agency land, those are really, really important and will grow in importance this year.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise, for sharing this knowledge. I know that steady and solid research really helps build the great foundation so that organizations can get to insights in all of their data. And, setting that benchmark is really so important. So thank you guys both for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it. What a great kickoff to 2021. No matter what other things might be happening, I think being able to take this time into focus. And thank you everyone for joining us and for the great questions. We do look to have additional webinars this year and really make it so that it's interactive, and it's going to give you that takeaway knowledge that you can apply same day to give you that benefit. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.
Thanks everyone.
So much, Jonna. You're a tour de force.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.